It is Christmas Eve 2020, and you're listening to Skeptics with a K, the podcast for science, reason, and critical thinking. Skeptics with a K is a production of the Merseyside Skeptics Society, a non-profit organisation for the promotion of scientific skepticism on Merseyside around the UK and at Christmas. I am your host, Mike Hall. With me today is Marsh.
Hello.
And Alice.
Hello.
And it's Christmas Eve.
It is. What's on everyone's Christmas list? Is it number 1, Pfizer, number 2, AstraZeneca, number 3, Moderna?
So, yeah, Merry Christmas, guys. How are you both?
I mean, those are two very separate statements.
That's
Merry
fair.
Christmas.
That is fair.
We're all going to have a lovely Yuletide. We're all shit. We're all fucked. We're all miserable. Things are terrible. But, you know, Christmas in it. 2020 is nearly over. That January 1st, 2021, everything will be brilliant.
I know, I'm getting really sick of all the end of year roundups people are doing where they seem to be all optimistic about next year. It's no, it's just more of the same. In fact, it's worse. It's worse because we're out of fucking the EU by then.
Yeah. Well, it's not even necessarily worse because we're out of the EU, because that shows a political bias that we, on this podcast, all share, that being out of the EU is a really bad idea. But what makes it specifically worse is that we are leaving the EU without a deal. We haven't got any agreements on anything. And a tiny sliver of people who thought leaving the EU was a good thing thought this was a good idea. Everybody else was told this will definitely 100% never happen. And Here we are. Unless an agreement is made within, I think it's the next 48 hours, we leave with currently no way of getting anything we make in this country out to market, and nothing that's made outside of this country in, which means things like, PPE, syringes, chemicals you might use to produce a vaccine. Insulin, famously, is pretty much all manufactured in Norway, the UK supply of insulin. So anybody who isn't really bothered about Brexit but is bothered about diabetes should also be bothered about Brexit. But here we are. Merry Christmas, everybody.
But it's Christmas time, so, you know, ho, ho, ho.
So we can all have lots of fun with our families and
on Zoom.
Spend time with our loved ones. And
on Skype.
Lots of tiny little super spreader events taking place all around the country. That's going to be exciting. Whew. So a good down note to start the show on. Yeah, so this is a peculiar episode of Skeptics with a K, because what we're going to do this show is we're going to be answering listener questions.
Is that peculiar? We've done these shows before.
We've done them before, but they are few and far between.
We haven't done one for ages. We haven't done one for ages and ages.
It depends what the definition of peculiar is, because if the definition of peculiar is out of the ordinary, then I think this would constitute. If it was unprecedented, once in a lifetime,
like COVID
event. Like the old Corvs there, then this wouldn't be peculiar. So I've no idea what the strictest definition of peculiar actually is.
I think it is peculiar yet precedented.
It's fully precedented.
Episode of Skeptics with a K. So we're going to be answering listener questions. We put a call out in the last episode for people to send in questions for us to talk about on air. Lots of people have done, which is really good. So we got a big list of questions to get through today, which I'm quite excited for. Just
before we get to that, you know how COVID has evolved to become more transmissible?
Yes.
Does that not, the timing of it is interesting, because we just got to a point where vaccines, literally it was the week after vaccines were being actually administered, COVID then ramps up to be more transmissible. And it feels like it's the boss level in the game. And as we're starting to make some advances towards that, oh my God, oh no, there's the third act twist kind of thing of everything looks like it's going to get a lot trickier. It is very odd that it's not odd in a sense of suspicious, but it does feel very scripted that COVID has got that little bit more complicated just as we start to sort of have a chance to advance on it.
And there is a reasonable chance that that's not a coincidence either. For one, I understand, and listeners take this with a massive handful of salt because this is all off the top of my head and not researched properly. But the new strain of COVID was actually identified in mid-September. They just didn't tell anyone about it until after the vaccine had been announced. Now, whether they deliberately waited for the vaccine to be announced before they mentioned it, I don't know. But it could well be the case that that's why it suddenly, as there's light at the end of the tunnel, suddenly there's this extra twist.
Well, you say that, Mike, but I'm very confused then, because Boris Johnson, not only today as of recording, but also the other day when he cancelled Christmas, was very clear that he only found out about this new transmissible form of COVID on Friday, and he notified the WHO within 24 hours. So why is it that if it really was identified in September and was explained to the House of Parliament by Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, on Monday of last week, How could either of those things be possibly true if Boris Johnson only found out about them 24 hours earlier? Presumably Matt Hancock didn't get up in Parliament and talk about it, and all the Hansard records of a direct verbatim transcript of that script, that speech that he gave, are lies, because Boris Johnson only found out about it 24 hours before he cancelled Christmas and told the WHO about it.
Shall we start with this now?
I'm so mad. Yeah,
but it's Christmas Eve and everybody else is really mad and all our listeners are really mad and no one wants to listen to this miserable bollocks anymore. So let's pretend it's not happening for a bit until we get a question. Until we get a question about COVID, and then we'll start talking about it again.
Yeah, good point. Let's go all upbeat and happy and cheery. Mike, off you go.
I wasn't saying that. That's just as fucking annoying. I'm getting really pissed off by people trying to say, oh, think of something great that's come out of 2020. Fuck off.
I mean, just to be clear, that is one of the questions we're going to be answering. And also, part of that be upbeat, Mike, is I know what the first question is. So off you go, Mike.
Let's get a nice upbeat question to kick off with. So Thomas Kewer sent us a question, and Tom says, social media has been part of our lives now for so long, it feels like just part of how the world works. Facebook is old enough to vote in Scottish parliamentary elections. However, its benefits and detriments to society are still hotly debated. Do you consider social media to be overall a net good or ill? Now, I'm pretty sure that what Thomas is referring to here is a conversation that Alice and I had on Twitter several weeks ago now, where I was just having a particularly shitty time. And I went on a big ranty bender about how social media has ruined the fucking world. And Alice came in with some quite reasonable but stuff of kind of what about this really good thing and this really good thing, including things like, you know, Alice having met her partner on social media and things like that. And we got some way into that conversation and then thought, actually, let's if we're going to talk about this, let's do it on air. And then we never did. And so it could be a coincidence, or it could be Tom forcing our hand there and saying, have that fucking argument. I want to see the end of it. So what do we think? Social media, net good or net ill on society?
It's impossible to answer that specific question without research, because we all have our own particular positions of privilege that mean we're not affected by some of the net negative parts of social media, I think. We're all like, yes, we are affected by some of the negative parts of social media, but not some of the very worst parts of it. So I think it's impossible for us to say without having researched. But for me personally, I think it's net positive. I know there's a lot of shit on there. I know it's terrible, but it has genuinely enhanced my life. If it weren't for social media, I wouldn't have met my partner, who I've now been with for 15 years. I don't think I would have met you guys. Like, I know, so I knew about the Merseyside Skeptics Society through listening to this podcast, but you set up this podcast because you guys met on Meetup. Like, yeah. I mean, that's an event management thing, but it's a bit of social media there as well. Like, you are engaging with people on it.
I think it's probably reasonable to characterize Meetup as social media, at least to the extent that we had used it. But
yeah, I think I probably wouldn't characterize it as social media, but I do sort of take your point. I mean, I think it's very unlikely that the MSS would have survived as long if there wasn't Facebook, if there wasn't Twitter, where we could not only put out the events that we were doing and so people can see it, and put out the pieces they were writing, put out the show and gain an audience and put that in front of people, but also finding the things to be skeptical of it was much, much easier when there was a very fertile skeptical network of people highlighting bollocks that you could sort of subscribe to. So I do completely get that. I mean, part of me does think that social media, well, I was going to say part of me thinks that social media is a huge ill. I think more specifically, the companies that control and fail to control social media, they are what is wrong. I think the fact that the corporate aspect of social media is what is wrong. The fact that conspiracy theories go viral on Facebook, the fact that Facebook was going out of its way to promote conspiracy theories at various points through this pandemic, I think are unquestionably a net negative. It's sort of like saying the printing press can be responsible for the distribution of propaganda, but I don't blame that propaganda on the printing press. I blame it on the people who were printing it, and not the actual technology itself.
And this was the crux pretty much of mine and Mike's argument, because for me, it's social media isn't inherently bad. Technology isn't inherently bad. The internet isn't inherently bad. people are pretty much inherently bad. Human beings are pretty much just awful. It's ours. It's our fault.
I'm going to push back on that. I don't think human beings are awful.
No, but a lot of we break everything we have collectively. And I think that's the issue. And actually, more than that, it's capitalism that's the issue. It's trying to make money out of things that has caused the greatest problems with social media. It's humans pushing things to make more money and therefore making them worse.
Yeah, the incentive structure is what's particularly bad about social media. The incentive being to algorithmically drive people towards content that you find to be that is likely to be engaging, and understanding that the ways that you can psychologically nudge people are likely to be ways that aren't nudging towards something positive. You know, the thing that engages people the most is almost always sensational.
Yeah.
Whether that's sensationalism that is based on a falsehood or sensationalism about pointing out that falsehood, it's still the same kind of bread and circuses kind of sensationalism. And and incentivizing people to put out material that fits those shapes in order to get more eyes on them, in order to get more further down the line advertising and profit. I think that's a broken incentive structure. And Facebook is entirely broken because of its profit motive incentive structure rather than the actual technology or anything behind it.
But also, like, in the same way that humans are inherently bad, humans are also inherently good. Like, bringing lots of humans together in a space is going to have positive effects because humans are great and we do great things. And when we socialize together and work together on things, we do fantastic things. So, like, you've got both the negatives and the positives. You just smash them both together and then added in trying to make money on top of it.
Yeah.
I think Facebook is a particularly egregious offender here. Twitter as well, but Facebook especially is a particularly egregious offender here. There's currently a big ongoing dispute between Facebook and Apple, which is because Apple have got a new feature that they've got planned for the latest iPhone, which will say, hey, this application wants to track you using this data, this data, this data, and this data. Is that cool? And if you say no, they won't let them have the data. And Facebook is saying, you're going to destroy our advertising business by doing that. Except they're not saying that. They're saying you're going to destroy the advertising of all these small businesses who depend upon Facebook in order to be able to drive traffic. And that's the argument Facebook's trying to make. And it doesn't actually seem to be washing. I've not seen an article in the technology press saying, yeah, Facebook's right. They're all saying, this is Facebook clutching at fucking straws, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Because Facebook's argument, when you read what their argument is, boils down to, if people knew what we were doing, they wouldn't let us do it. And that's exactly true. I've spoken on this show about the way that Facebook, sneaks around and tracks people. I know, Marsh, you've talked about the crimes of Facebook on this show as well. Facebook is particularly bad for that. Twitter as well. Like Donald Trump's Twitter platform, any other user would have been deleted. And yes, the reason that Donald Trump wasn't was because he brings a terrific amount. They've said, it's because he's the president, etc. No, it's because what he does is drive traffic, because people will follow him and engage with his stuff. And that's a healthy thing for the Twitter platform to have.
I mean, it's worse than that. Twitter even used to advertise before he was president, when he was still running as a candidate. Twitter was advertising based on access to what Donald Trump was saying. There was a big advert in, I think it was like a Subway, essentially saying, find out what he'll tweet next, with a big picture of Donald Trump. And that was an advert for Twitter. So yeah, that exact thing, that sensationalism, is the dark side of what it's doing.
It's the model, yeah.
It's the sensationalist incentive structure. And I think you're right, Alice, that it is capitalism, although, again, we're pretty lefty here. We've got listeners who will be centrist. We'll have listeners who lean economically right. And even then, I would say it's not necessarily all capitalism, but it's undeniable that the form of capitalism that we're seeing there is toxic.
Yeah.
The idea that a company like Facebook can become so huge and dominant, that it can take such a huge slice of advertising margins for what is essentially a level of return that they themselves control. You can't use it very efficiently for free anymore. You have to boost events as a group, as a community group, because if you don't boost the events financially, you're not going to be seen by people. That kind of level of essentially monopoly is what they have. And that is what's broken. And so much of that trickles down. It's the only thing that trickles down here, but it trickles down into the day-to-day experiences you have, where the people you see on your timeline are the ones who will infuriate you, because provoking an emotion in you is more likely to keep you engaged, more likely to have you commenting and reacting. And the emotions that are most likely to do that are the extreme ones, and not, isn't it a lovely day, here's a picture of me salad.
But that's been the case outside of social media as well, that newspapers have got more and more sensationalist over the last several years, and the headlines that get people to read are the ones that get people outraged and angry and annoyed, and they're the ones that get passed around and discussed in the office and whatever. Like, it's not unique to social media.
No, it's true. It's true.
But a lot of this is bound up in a kind of absolutist interpretation of what free speech means as well, especially with regard to Facebook and Twitter, where they will frequently argue it's free speech. For people to say what they want on our platform, it's free speech. And it's perhaps a controversial thing to say that, you know, maybe kind of absolute free speech maybe isn't a terrific idea. And we accept curbs on free speech all of the time. The classic one that's given, which I think it came from a US court case, was you're not allowed to shout fire in a crowded theatre, that sort of thing. But platforms like Twitter and Facebook are not obliged to offer free speech to anyone. They are private platforms, and they hide behind saying things like, well, it's because First Amendment, isn't it? We're allowed, you know, we have to support free speech. Well, actually, no, that's a choice. That's a choice that you have made for your platform, because this is a private platform owned by a private company. It's not a public space at all. It's a choice that they have made to say we're going to accept Nazis on our platform and call it free speech, and we're going to knowingly accept misinformation on our platform and call it free speech. And I think that's problematic. Now, I don't have a solution to that. I'm not sure that the answer to that is, okay, right, well, we'll just ban everything, and it's somebody's job to say, well, that's okay and that's not okay, because that leads to dangerous places as well. So I don't know what the right answer to that is. But the answer that they've gone with, which is more or less a free-for-all, turns out to be really problematic.
Yeah, and I think that's it. I think there isn't an obvious solution to this, but when you raise those kind of questions, people will say, well, unless you have the solution to that problem, you can't say anything, you can't criticize in any way the solution they've come up with. And the difference is, I'm not making literally billions of dollars a year out of not having a solution to that problem. The solution that they've gone with, coincidentally, is the one that makes them the most money and essentially abdicates the most responsibility. And that whole idea of free speech is something that unfortunately we come across quite often in skepticism, because I think people can be very easily misled by rhetoric around free speech, because I absolutely believe that we have a right to free speech, but I also think we have a responsibility in doing that. And what people can mistakenly think is that there's the adage that the real test of free speech is whether you allow speech you disagree with, whether you listen to speech that is objectionable, and whether you will allow that speech to happen. And that's the commitment to free speech. And that is true. But the corollary of that isn't true, that any speech that is objectionable is therefore a virtue to platform, as by way of showing your commitment to free speech. Because what that inevitably means is universities around the country book a lecture tour for Katie Hopkins as a way of proving how keen they are on free speech. You'll never see them have the same kind of commitment to free speech for example, a radical extreme left position of, we've got someone who's saying bring down the entire government and live in small anarcho-commune systems. You'll never see that. What you'll see is, I dislike brown people and think they should drown in the English Channel. It is a virtue to put on a speech from me because of the commitment to free speech. It's the easiest thing in the world to do right now is to make a lot of money out of free speech grifting. It's why we see someone like Brian Rose at London Real making literally hundreds of thousands of pounds per, I think it was, month at one point, out of claiming to be all about standing up for free speech, when what he was actually doing was platforming anti-vaxxer after anti-vaxxer during a pandemic. It's the easiest thing in the world to do right now. And again, YouTube was allowing a lot of that to happen. So it comes back to that abdication of responsibility from the people who are housing those these speeches. I think the reason the pandemic in part has been as bad as it is because of how much conspiracy theory and rumor mongering and misinformation has gone viral across all these platforms. And the reason it's been able to do that is because they've had this completely hands-off, everything is absolutely fine unless it's within a very small prescribed, you can say what you like on Facebook as long as you don't show a nipple, essentially. That's the line that they've drawn there.
And that's a really interesting point as well, because it demonstrates the level of which this is about that kind of puritanical American sensibility, particularly, where any amount of violence, and whether that's violence as speech or, as in direct violence, is okay, but any kind of sexual content is not. And Facebook do a very good job of keeping adult content off their platform, because they're not saying, well, it's free speech for someone to have their boobs out on their Facebook profile. They're not defending the free speech of that, but they will defend the free speech of people sitting up there saying entire ethnic groups need to be wiped out or treated as less than human.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, betrays that it's fundamentally, actually, I think probably comes from the religious right in the United States, is where that sort of puritanical thinking comes from. It's something that's bothered me about The Boys. Have you guys watched The Boys?
Yes, it's brilliant.
Alice keeps trying to make me watch it, and I haven't
because
yet.
You absolutely should watch it. I'm about halfway through the second series, so I haven't finished watching the second series, but it's brilliant.
Terrific satire, The Boys. It's kind of it's a satire of the modern superhero genre, but they're also using it to satirize just the current climate, the current culture, everything. They're doing a terrific job on it. But because it's made directly for Amazon Prime, where a lot of this this is going off on a mad tangent here, where a lot of this...
We're miles away from social media right now.
Yeah.
Where a lot of this US puritanical thinking comes from is the FCC, where the FCC regulated the broadcast spectrum, and so it was up to the FCC was allowed to say what gets transmitted and what doesn't. And they had a very much no nudity, violence is okay, but no nudity, which is why you end up with things like RoboCop, which is just a terrific amount of gore and violence, and that's okay, but no one gets naked in it. And the cable companies managed to sidestep that because you're not FCC regulated, because you don't transmit over the airways, you're going down a cable, which meant cable television had this reputation for being a little bit more saucy and a little bit more seedy. And you get Game of Thrones where you'd see people with their arse out and then the occasional cock and things like that. But then Amazon just takes that to the next level, that it is utterly unregulated by anything. And then you watch The Boys and you see the stuff that they would make if it weren't for the fact the FCC won't let them is absolutely astonishing, because the level of sexual violence and gore and nudity and everything in The Boys is obscene. It is absolutely obscene.
Yeah.
And it makes me think, I'm not sure I should be watching that. The first episode of The Boys, I nearly didn't watch the second because I felt so ill from watching it. I'm really encouraging you to watch it here, Marsh.
I know the scene you're referring to, and that scene is excellently done. It is a fantastic scene, but it's a fantastic scene because it's so realistically unsettling.
Yes. Yeah. I was so disturbed watching that, and it was only because Lana was kind of, I'm really enjoying this, I think we should watch it again, that I carried on watching it. But I thought that was really interesting, that, watching what a movie studio, TV studio would make without any shackles on them whatsoever.
It is very gory. It is unnecessarily gory. I don't love the gore in it, but the actual show itself is brilliant.
I mean, having not seen it, it feels a little like what is essentially first and foremost a tech company with financial incentives moving towards more and more sensationalist content, because that's where the incentives lie. But I've not seen it, so maybe I'll watch it and have a look.
Which, oddly enough, is something The Boys satirizes terrifically well.
Yeah, it is.
Should we move on to the next question? We have a question from Alistair, who asks, are there any apps or social platforms that you think are doing a good job of combating misinformation or woo?
No.
None of the mainstream ones that I use.
I think everyone's fucking this up.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Maybe there are some small niche ones that are doing it fantastically, but I only use the mainstream ones, and they're all doing a terrible job.
I think I'd agree, and I think that the thing is, the places, the things that they are doing that are good don't outweigh the things they are not doing that allow bad to flourish. And we saw this when I talked a little while ago about Facebook bringing in rules to curtail QAnon accounts. If you were using your account specifically and explicitly to spread QAnon content, and they shout from high heavens how great that is. At the same time, they talk about how they no longer allow Holocaust denial material, obviously meaning that they did up until that point, and that point was a couple of months ago. That prior to that, Holocaust denial was part of that unfettered free speech. But the flip side of that being, as I covered on the show, Facebook wouldn't stop you using your regular account to promote all of that QAnon stuff, so long as you didn't call yourself QAnon fan 69 or whatever, which just is wholly inadequate. And it's a change that it's a plaster, but it's not even a plaster over the actual wound. It's a plaster over somewhere more visible, when the actual wound is somewhere less visible and is completely festering and is unchecked at all. And so, yeah, I don't know of any platforms that are doing enough to counter the amount of stuff that's out there, or are proactively on top of what's out there. Even something like Amazon and eBay, all they do, I think there's a piece in the Telegraph, I think just this week, it might actually be out tomorrow, I'm not sure, about the amount of products available on Amazon that claim to be things that you can attach to your phone to stop the EMF radiation, or Faraday cages you can put your router in to prevent you being harmed by Wi-Fi. And I haven't seen any response from Amazon yet, but I guarantee the most they will do is take down the specific products that have been listed, specific ones that they've been alerted to, but they won't do anything to stop exactly the same products going up again. They won't do anything to stop products making the same claims again. They won't do anything to look for other products that might be making misleading claims, because all they'll do is the least they can get away with in order to maintain the reputation that they have without having to invest the kind of money it would take to be actually responsible about what they're doing. And that is the fix we've seen right across the board everywhere.
Mm.
And Alistair also asks, could you set up a Facebook group where people can quickly share pseudoscience adverts that they get? That's an interesting idea. It's something we've thought about before as Merseyside Skeptics Society, as to whether we could have like a reporter quack kind of feature. Yeah, I think it's a nice idea. Maybe it's something we should take a look into, and maybe we'll return to that on future shows, Alistair.
In the meantime, we do like when people email us stuff, but we like barely ever reply. We're really bad at replying because we get quite a lot of emails and we're all insanely busy.
I'd also suggest that maybe a Facebook group isn't the ideal
no.
venue. Given everything we've just said, maybe it's not the ideal venue for doing something like that in, but, who knows?
We've got a question from Emma, the best podcast guest, McClure.
Okay, is that her middle name?
Gaming the system.
That her middle name, is
Gaming the system is the name there.
She asked, when are you going to give the people what they want, aka when is the next drunk episode?
The only people who want that is Emma, the best podcast guest, McClure. She was present for the absolute horror show that was, and I'll put my hands up, all entirely my fault, of the first drunk episode. And with that in mind, there is very little chance Mike will allow us to do a second drunk episode.
I mean, I haven't done a first drunk episode. I was sober as a fucking judge all the way through that one.
So are you saying you need to catch up first?
And all the way through the editing. We do now have an external editor in Morgan, so maybe it will be less of a headache because you won't have to edit it.
No.
I'll still have to live with it, so no.
I also think sending a recording of that type to Morgan would probably count as an act of war.
It would certainly be hostile working environment.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's probably never going to happen, is it? Maybe a tiddly episode. Just a little bit tiddly episode. Emma also asked, what can we skeptics do about all of this? Waves vaguely around. How do we keep going when everything seems to be getting worse, conspiracy/pseudoscience wise?
Yeah, anyone want to go in first on that?
I'd love to, but it's Christmas and I want to bring the tone down again.
It's something me and Mike have talked about a lot before, in that you want to know more. As being a good skeptic, you want to know more about QAnon, you want to know more about how all these conspiracies are shaping up and where it's all going, but it's also so depressing because I just feel completely impotent. There's nothing we can do, and I don't have any answers on how to make it better. So knowing about this terrible thing just feels completely futile. In
all honesty, it really gets on top of me sometimes, especially, and I've talked about this on the show before, but especially the QAnon Pizzagate stuff just seems so out of control and so big and so untacklable. In a way that homeopathy, for example, felt and indeed feels tackleable. It's a relatively fringe view. The people who aren't in the fringe who believe it don't believe it all that terrifically strongly, whereas the people who are QAnon believers, even the people who aren't in the extreme QAnon, they're just the pastel QAnon folks, believe it fervently.
Yeah, but I think even on your metrics there, I think the Pizzagate stuff is way, way, way more fringe. I think the distinction is the people who don't really fully believe it, you're comparing to the average person in the street who's heard of homeopathy, when more realistically, they should be compared to the people who go and regularly buy homeopathy but aren't homeopaths. There are more people who are homeopaths than there are hardcore QAnon believers.
Yes, I think probably fair.
By several order of magnitude, I imagine. And there are more people who regularly take and put their faith in homeopathy as just consumers than there are people who would believe any of the Pizzagate stuff. The difference is the Pizzagate stuff is, one, entirely online. Like, in the sense of that it is an online phenomenon. There are people spill out on the streets. but it's very, very online in the way that homeopathy isn't and never really was. It's still clinics, it's still people in their cupboards, it's still shelves of shops, but it's not really that passionate online because it's pre-scientific, I guess, to a degree. So the QAnon stuff is a very online phenomenon anyway, and that gives it much more prominence. And it is so out there in the basics of what it's saying that gives it a lot of prominence as well, because it's extreme. And the reason you heard about it wasn't because you met a QAnon believer or a conspiracy theory believer or heard directly from them. You heard about it from everybody pointing at it and going, Jesus Christ, that is really extreme. And if it wasn't as extreme, as homeopathy isn't really as extreme, then I don't think it would have got as much attention. So I think it's a very small thing. I think there's elements of it that are believed in a much broader way. But I think the number of people in the UK who believe that kind of stuff is numbering in the single-digit thousands, I would imagine.
Sure, I can see what you're driving at, but what I'm not seeing is marches through Liverpool city centre in favour of homeopathy on a regular basis. And I'm also, the jeopardy seems smaller with homeopathy as well. The QAnon stuff is incredibly disruptive to our culture, to our society, to people's relationships with each other in a way that homeopathy is just not. Which is not to say homeopathy is harmless, because we've spent a fucking decade having a pop at it.
I think there are more people dying because of homeopathy in 2020 than there are dying because of QAnon. Maybe not quite because of the lockdown paranoia and the COVID denialism that goes with a lot of QAnon beliefs.
That's fair. Yeah, that's fair.
But I mean, but those also go with homeopathy. And in fact, still right now, members of the Society of Homeopaths are regularly posting about how you shouldn't take the vaccine. I mean, I think the QAnon conspiracy theory is really pernicious and fascinating and depressing and all of those things. But just when you compare it to homeopathy, I think actually homeopathy is much more widespread than that. I think it's the tiniest little barking dog. It's Alice's dog Micah. It's really small, but it's so loud that you think, Jesus Christ, there must be at least a really big dog there. But it's not. It's just small and loud.
On a broader sense, though, conspiracies in general and conspiracy theories in general are getting more and more mainstream. People are believing more of them, and it is starting to have an influence on a wider range of people, and that feeds into things like anti-vax belief and things that actually are going to be directly harmful. And it all, especially the scale of it, feels completely insurmountable, I think, a lot of the time. It does feel like there's small things we can do to help, and certainly we get some nice, encouraging emails from listeners who say, thanks to finding your podcast at around the time. We had an email from a listener fairly recently who said, I was listening to your podcast around the same time that I was diagnosed with breast cancer and was introduced to pseudoscientific belief from my yoga class or other places that they'd been. And thanks to listening to the podcast, I didn't go down that route. And even if we help just a handful of people in those sorts of situations, then I think that's a really positive thing. And it's, Emma specifically asked, how do we keep going when it keeps getting worse? I think there is some positive that skeptics are doing in the world.
Yeah.
But it does often feel quite insurmountable.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think the way we keep going is to keep banking the wins when we have them, to keep recognizing the difference we're making. And I wrote a piece many moons ago now for The Guardian. I think it's something. It's an analogy that I quite often come back to, which is the Sisyphean struggle of pushing the boulder up the hill, and it returns to its starting point every morning, and that's what we're doing. But the thing is, if we weren't pushing that boulder uphill, it wouldn't stay still. It'd be even further down the hill. It'd be in a much more damaging place. The stuff that we're seeing in the world is happening not in spite of what we're doing. It's still limited to some degree by what we're doing.
Yeah,
that we are having an effect, and that is causing it to be limited. And if we weren't here doing it, things would be in a much worse position, I honestly think. So that's what we keep acknowledging, the fact that we are making a difference, even as we have the roller coasters, ups and downs of pseudoscience being on top for a while. I'm going to ask this question from Bryce from Canada, who would like an update on Mike's computer building escapades, if you're willing to share them. What components has he built, and what components is he therefore now allowed to buy?
Yeah, so for listeners who aren't aware of this, I set myself a challenge a couple of years ago now of trying to build my own microprocessor, my own computer. With the rules that I've set for myself is I broadly understand how a transistor works. I've got a physics A level. I pretty much know how a transistor works. And so I have to be able to build something before I'm allowed to buy it. So I started off by making logic gates out of transistors. Once I was able to make an OR gate, an AND gate, a NOT gate, etc., I was able to go out and purchase those things on chips because, okay, I know I could build that if I needed to, so I can just go and buy them, which is a lot smaller than me building it out of physical transistors. And I've slowly been working up from there. So, I built an SR latch and I built a D latch. And there's a great YouTube channel called Computer File where a lot of this stuff is explained in reasonably easy to understand terms, with the intention of eventually working my way up to building a full microprocessor, although it probably wouldn't be so micro. It'd probably actually be quite chunky because it's got to be on a scale that I can actually build. But unfortunately, all that stalled, all that ground to a halt when I moved house, because I had to pack all the stuff, all my oscilloscope, all my circuits, everything got packed away. And because of the pandemic, I've not even had the opportunity. I've been moved for a year now, and I still haven't had the opportunity to get everything unpacked properly. So I haven't even got my workbench set back up yet. The most complicated thing I've built so far is I built a 555 timer, which is a particular kind of chip that you can go out and purchase. And it's a very commonly used chip. It's a really, really cute little design. And I managed to make a 555 timer out of logic gates. The hardest thing in that was building a comparator circuit, which I had no idea how to build. And what I did, and this is true story, I asked Steve Verber, who designed the ARM chip, I said, how do you build a comparator? And he told me, and so I did that, which seems a long way around to do that. But he said, yeah, have a look at long tail pair. That's what you want to do. Look at building a long tail pair. So I did that, and it worked a treat. So talk about going to the top for doing experiments like that. So unfortunately it's stalled, but I'm sure once I manage to get back into it, I'll continue to give silly updates on the show about, oh my God, look, I've just built, 1 bit of RAM. Who's excited?
We've got a question from Louis, who asked, are there people/views within skepticism you find objectionable? When James Randi died, I found it pretty uncomfortable the way people were acting as if he was a saint when he had some pretty unpleasant opinions.
Well, to take the first question first, people and views within skepticism I find objectionable. Yes, lots of people.
Yeah.
Especially the kind of Michael Shermer-y end of skepticism, which might be a libelous thing for me to say, but I find Michael Shermer personally objectionable. I don't like him as a person. I don't agree with a terrific number of his views.
Well, he publishes an awful lot of stuff, which, publishes stuff praising Milo Yiannopoulos, praising that absolutely dogshit bit of academia that was the conceptual penis bollocks. That was just a really badly done so-called hoax. It's just very flimsy skepticism when it comes to something he is really interested in or passionate about.
Yeah, when it's straight up confirmation bias stuff that he should be aware of, is that when it's a view he agrees with, his skepticism radar seems to go by the wayside. And we do that too. We're guilty of that too. We everyone fucks it up. Everyone fucks this up. But I do find those views objectionable, and it's something that I struggle with a lot, seeing that coming out of people who notionally on the same page as we are on issues like this. And even since we've been running Skeptic Magazine, there are a non-zero number of times we've had to say, not that Skeptic Magazine.
Yeah.
Because people think that we're going to be affiliated with those people and therefore those views, which is a problem. It's a problem because those aren't views that I particularly share.
Yeah, I think I broadly agree with that. I think there are people who certainly used to be quite involved in skepticism who aren't anymore, and I find those people and those views highly objectionable. But I also don't think they're involved in skepticism. And it's why it gets quite frustrating when people say, well, UK skepticism is this. And you want to say, well, make a list of everyone you know who thinks that, and then see if they're still involved in skepticism, because the majority of people I've seen who actually hold a lot of the kind of positions that a lot of people are attributing to UK skepticism aren't people who would even necessarily consider themselves part of UK skepticism
anymore, yeah.
And certainly wouldn't be considered by a lot of people in UK skepticism either. So I find that objectionable, but I also find objectionable essentially the holier than thou skeptic, that kind of instant reaction, judgment and condemnation without necessarily having a lot of compassion or really thought about ability to empathize with the people you're criticizing. I find that quite tricky. And it stems in part from that style of skepticism, which is, well, I'm a skeptic, so I must be right. Or I've spent a long time doing critical thinking, and therefore I'm right on these things. And so the judgment I come to must itself be the critical thinking position. And therefore the things that I say flow from that are beyond question, and certainly themselves couldn't be subject to the same kind of scrutiny. And if anybody was to subject it to that kind of scrutiny, then I'll double down and point out how wrong they are and how outrageous they are and that kind of stuff. I find the lack of acceptance that the positions you're taking may themselves be subject to scrutiny and revision. I think that's the stuff that I find really, that's also some of the stuff that I find objectionable before we come to the rest of it. And Alice?
But yeah, I think you're right. There's a big problem with people who use their skepticism to justify their beliefs that are not based in evidence. And we talk about it amongst ourselves quite a lot. It's certainly a problem that gets levelled a lot recently through UK skepticism. And, you know, I think this is an opportunity for us to say, and I think we've made it clear on more than one occasion, we do not think that people who are transphobic and claim to be skeptics are skeptics. Like, those views are objectionable. We will not support them. And for me, at the minute, that's the thing that's right at the forefront of my mind, because it's everywhere, but it's that thing that I find universally problematic. It's people who try to claim that because they are rational, because they are evidence-based, because they are skeptical, they are therefore right on the conclusion they've come to. And it's a thing that we, as a podcast, do our best to avoid constantly and say, do you know what? We could be wrong, because we're humans. We're biased and we make mistakes and we fuck things up. And just because we're skeptics doesn't mean you should take us as right. And I think there's a lot of people who, you're right, they say they might have been part of skepticism once. They're probably no longer even call themselves skeptics, let alone are accepted by the skeptical movement, especially in the UK. But if you're trying to use skepticism and rationalism to try and justify beliefs that are really unreasonable, unscientific, and not evidence-based, then you're not a skeptic. That's a problem.
And then just on the other half of that kind of question, when James Randi died, and how Lewis said that he found it uncomfortable that people were acting as if he was a saint. To be honest, I found a lot of really uncomfortable stuff around the way people talked when Randi died, more in the way that they were painting him out to have been a eugenicist, and also bringing up that, you know that Randi was a climate change denier. And it's like, well, yeah, he wrote a blog where he was a climate change denier, and then later said, actually, I was wrong about that stuff. And it turns out that I should follow the science on that. And I was speaking beyond the stuff that I actually can understand for myself and speaking beyond my own ability. And I found it really frustrating that for someone who spent a long time building the thing that we do, and it's very hard to go back and say, well, this is the thing that kicked that off. But it's also quite difficult to find anybody who's listening to this show, the thing that got you into skepticism. Remember that person, that show, that figure, that lecture. Follow that back. And in lots of those cases, Randi was the first domino that was flicked. Even to this, I started getting into skepticism because I started listening to the SGU. I started listening to the SGU because I wanted to hear what Teller from Penn and Teller sounded like. And Penn and Teller were involved in skepticism and were together as a double act because they met James Randi. And so there is this kind of first domino flicked kind of thing going on. And I don't think anybody should or ought to or even necessarily was right to talk about Randi as a saint. And I think Randi would be the first in the queue to say we shouldn't sanctify people. He didn't even want himself to be talked about in the sense of he's passed over or he's passed away or anything like that. He just wanted people to say Randi's dead, he's not here anymore, essentially, because he didn't want that. But also, I think there was this really distasteful jumping on the other side of that to say, well, this guy's dead, and although he died today, here is some things I found that he said that I find objectionable. When even if those were positions he sincerely held, and my understanding is on both the climate change thing and the social Darwinism, not eugenics, but social Darwinism. I mean, it's a splitting hairs thing, but I think those are very different positions anyway. Eugenics, you're actively saying someone should go out and be killed. And social Darwinism is anybody who's ever posted something from the Darwin Awards and saying, oh yeah, they're taking themselves out of the gene pool, is as guilty of social Darwinism as James Randi. And I wouldn't support that at all. I fucking hate that stuff. But it's not eugenics to say that unless you are taking them out the gene pool yourself.
One can lead to the other. One belief in social Darwinism can lead to belief in eugenics. But yeah, that doesn't mean the two are exactly the same thing.
Exactly. It's a step on the way. But the next step is the one where you're killing people. And that's why there is different terms for the different parts of those steps for that reason. But even if he fully held those beliefs, and as I understand on both those, he recanted them both. And I know on the stuff he said that was construed as social Darwinism, he said that in his 80s, whilst on chemotherapy, as it happens, in an interview for a book in which I was also interviewed, and the section about me lies about me in several places. So I've got a lot of faith in that writer. But even if he'd fully held those beliefs, it'd still be really distasteful on the day the guy died to point out all of that. The guy had loved ones. He had a lot of people in this movement who loved him an awful lot, who respect him an awful lot. And I think the rule of thumb that I tend to have is wait until you'd be happy for someone to say it about your granddad after your granddad died. You know, we don't need to rush to expose the worst things people did when those people have done some very, very good things as well. We can have a very balanced view. We don't have to think of anybody as saints. I think that's bullshit idolatry. And it's the worst thing one of the worst things we do in skepticism, we as a community, is elevate people onto pedestals and make them untouchable. It's one of the reasons people who then go on to be incredibly bad actors get away with it for so long, because they're on those pedestals. You know, people don't feel like they can share their experiences of what Lawrence Krauss said or did to them in certain places because he's on such a pedestal among so many people. So that putting people on a pedestal is incredibly unhelpful. But equally, making hay from knocking someone off a pedestal on the day they died it just seems a bit icky, you know? I don't know what you guys think.
Oh, apparently Micah thinks Randy's awful because she's barking. I'm inclined to agree. Like Randy never did much for me. Like, I didn't get into skepticism, I don't think, through anything related to James Randi. I think he's a little bit before my time, perhaps. But I can still appreciate that he's had a massive influence on skepticism in general and has brought some incredible people into skepticism. And those people are great, whether or not he has unpleasant opinions or not. I'm sure he is a very flawed individual, or was a very flawed individual. Many people are. But you don't need to start slagging somebody off when they've just died. You can give it a bit of space and try and find the nuance in it and have a conversation that is considerate to lots of people's feelings, even if you don't want to be considerate to that person. If you really, really dislike a person who's died and you don't want to say anything nice about them, you don't have to still start slagging them off on the day they died, because the people who are going to hear that are potentially that person's loved ones. It's the loved ones you're hurting, not the actual person. Mm. And I'm sure there are exceptions to that, but
I think there was an article, like literally the day or two after he died, on, I think it was Boing Boing in the US, called James Randi, the Man Who Destroyed Skepticism. And it's a fucking ludicrous thing to think. For anybody who claims to have any understanding of the subject matter they're talking about, that is an indefensible position to take, regardless of what your opinions on Randy were as a man.
Let's move on to something a little bit more chipper. Emma, the Best Podcasts guest McClure, says, who is your favourite podcast guest and why is it her? Which is a bold position to take. She's certainly the most common podcast guest. I don't mean that in terms of
she's incredibly common. That's the thing we know about Emma.
Don't mean that in terms of her social background. But yeah, we've had Emma on as a guest more often than we've had anyone else on the show. And there's a reason for that. It's Emma's brings some good stuff, but that's not to say that all of the other guests that we've had on the podcast weren't also awesome, because they were.
Yeah, I mean, it really raised the question, why does she hate Laurie Phillips so much?
We've had some great guests on the podcast, and I think they've all been brilliant, and I'm glad that we can have people like that on the show, because, it's been a long old time to just be the three of us and then previously be the three of you guys. It's nice to have different people on, and they all bring something great. We're very lucky.
That is true.
Emma does go on to say, though, how much do you hate Love Actually, and is it worse than Twilight Breaking Dawn?
Oh, fucking hell. So me and Alice mentioned on the last episode that we've been watching the Twilight films. I think we mentioned that on air.
You did, yes.
And also that we were planning to watch lots of Christmas films. And we watched 6 of them in one day. And then during this week, just last week, we watched Love Actually. I'd never seen it before. I don't know if you'd seen it before, Alice?
I think I've seen half of it. I've never seen it the whole way through, but I've seen a good chunk of it.
I think it might be the worst film I've ever seen.
It is horrifically bad. It is astonishingly bad. And I'm amazed that so many women love it, because it's a chick flick and a load of women love it. And it amazes me, because we're supposed to all be fucking feminists, and it's a horrible film for women. It's awful.
Yeah. There are, I think there's maybe 1, maybe 2 characters who have any level of internal life and actual consistent personality. And both those characters end up fucked, basically, in it. Emma Thompson basically has...
Of the women, you mean?
Of the women, sorry, yes, yeah, of the women, yeah. So you've got Emma Thompson and Laura Linney arguably have the only kind of developed plot lines at all. And Laura Linney doesn't get to be with the man of her dreams because she's got a brother who's mentally ill and is in a care home and regularly calls her looking for support. And that's just a turn off for the man of her dreams. And we're supposed to think, oh yeah, that's what it's like, isn't it? Unfortunately, that's kind of...
You've got to choose between your caring responsibilities and your love life.
Yeah, your caring responsibilities and your one night stand. That's the choice you're presented with. And we're meant to think that you're bad for choosing your brother in that situation. Hugh Grant's the Prime Minister and he just wants to shag Marty McCutcheon, who is just the office lady. We don't really know what her job is. She brings him tea sometimes.
Well, he calls her the catering manager. I think she is essentially the tea lady. And she is... how Marty McCutcheon is treated in that film is horrific. She is referred to as fat the whole way through. She is not a fat person. Not that it would be bad to be a fat person, but the way that she's chastised for it the whole way through is used as a pejorative, and she's not even...
She's like probably a size 10 or 12 or something, maybe a size 12, something like that. Just because not only is it used pejoratively, it's also not remotely even an accurate description either way. It's ludicrous on both those points, really. Yeah, it is bad. It is bad. And that's before we get to Chris Marshall's storyline, which is he can't get laid in the UK, so he flies to America, walks into a bar, and immediately pulls 4 models who say, oh, maybe you want to come and live with us and have a foursome. A fivesome or whatever.
We like his accent.
And I thought it was so bad that I assumed he'd fallen asleep on the plane and we were seeing a dream sequence. But no, that was genuinely his storyline.
And then he brings one of them back as a wife or fiance and brings back an extra one for his mate.
Yeah, just brings a spare.
Good.
Just as a souvenir. I brought you this back from America.
Brought you this lady back.
I went all the way to America and all I got was this stupid model.
I've never seen this film. I've never seen this film at all.
It's utterly terrible. Like, the Twilight films were bad. I don't remember which one Breaking Dawn is, but...
The one where the werewolf falls in love with the baby.
Yeah, okay, so that is pretty abhorrent. But that's at least fictional.
I mean, they're all fictional, Alice.
I know they're all fictional, but...
You mean it's like fantasy?
People actually treat women like that. There aren't werewolves and there aren't vampire-human hybrid babies. Like, that's never... There's not a risk of that happening in the real world. There is a risk of someone calling Marty McCutcheon fat because she's not a size 0.
Yeah, the precedent that love actually sets. And what it sets as an aspirational relationship goal.
People love it. People properly love it. They watch it every year excitedly.
Yeah.
Maybe our listeners love it. I hope none of our listeners love it, but maybe watch it again with that lens on if you do and see how you feel about it.
I'm just saying, if any of our listeners do love it, they should stop listening immediately. They should go and become woos. They should become part of QAnon. That's the only reasonable thing to do from this point on.
I tell you what, we've really disappointed the SWAC listening party taking place at the Richard Curtis Appreciation Society this evening. They were properly excited for this and everything.
Oh, it's terrible. We've got questions from Kelly. Kelly asked, for Mike, I'm planning on subscribing to BritBox over my winter break. As of now, I've seen about 1 to 2 episodes each of Doctors 1 to 7. What would you consider essential classic Who episodes for a week-long Doctor Who binge? She says it might not be doable on the show, but she's counting on Mike's inability to ignore anything Doctor Who related.
It's always worth counting on something like that, in fairness. It's definitely something that you can count on. Yeah, I got a BritBox subscription recently, but that's because I decided I wanted, because I don't need BritBox to watch classic Doctor Who. I got them all, but I decided I wanted to watch One Foot in the Grave. I just had a
hankering for it.
I thought, you know,
you subscribed to BritBox just for One Foot in the Grave.
Literally for the 30-day free trial.
Oh, okay, fine. That makes more sense. I was going to say, bloody hell.
But literally, I went around every other streaming platform saying, has anyone got One Foot in the Grave? Only BritBox. And then when I signed up for BritBox, they'd said, exclusive to BritBox, One Foot in the Grave. So, for fuck's sake. But yeah, so no, if you want to watch some classic Doctor Who, some episodes for each of the 7th Doctor, well, for the first Doctor, you've got to watch An Unearthly Child. That's the first episode of the show. And especially the first episode of the first story, I think it still stands up as a good piece of television today. The other 3 episodes are a bit flabby, some bollocks about cavemen, but the first episode of the show still stands up very well. There's a few other really well-regarded episodes from the William Hartnell era, like The Aztecs, which is a very good historical story. The Dalek Invasion of Earth, I really, really enjoy, although it's quite bleak. The Time Meddler is really good. The War Machines is really good. So I'd recommend all of those if you got the opportunity to watch them. For the second Doctor, I'd recommend Tomb of the Cybermen. Really enjoyed Tomb of the Cybermen. So Tomb of the Cybermen was one of the missing episodes of Doctor Who. It was one of the ones that didn't exist when the BBC catalogued their archive back in the 70s. And it turned up in Hong Kong in 1992. And they rushed it straight onto VHS. And I remember being 12, 13 years old and biking into town on my bike to go and buy a copy of Tomb of the Cybermen. And it was Doctor Who videos at the time were $10.99 each on VHS. $10.99. This one was $12.99 and had gold foil, no, not gold foil, silver foil on the cover because it was special, because they just found it like a few weeks ago, effectively, and rushed it straight out into VHS together with a little interview with the director. And I remember being so excited about that. And that's a great fun story. There's also Web of Fear is another good story, which is the one, the discovery of Web of Fear, again, was a missing episode. That was discovered a few years ago, and that's the one that provoked the big smile that's on all of my avatars on my social media. That was when the Web of Fear was discovered. So go and watch the Web of Fear. And Sea to Death I quite enjoy as well. That's a good Patrick Troughton story. It's a little bit lighter weight than the other two, but it's a fun story. The third Doctor, I'd recommend Spearhead from Space, which is his very first story, which I feel like so many other stories subsequent to that have copied that format as a way to introduce a new Doctor. The Demons is really good. The Green Death is an excellent Doctor Who story. The thing about The Green Death is it had this very pro-environmentalist message. It was very, we're destroying the rainforest, we're destroying the planet, and pollution and chemicals and things like that. And this was in 1973, and somehow still we're fucking it up now. Somehow.
Doctor Who couldn't fix it. Didn't fix it.
Not good enough.
Somehow this had managed to permeate into culture enough that Doctor Who was doing stories about how we're ruining the rainforest and we need to stop in 1973. And nevertheless, we're still fucking doing it. So The Green Death is really good. And Planet of the Spiders is a really good story as well. Planet of the Spiders is the story that kind of introduces the concept of regeneration in the way that we would understand it as Doctor Who fans today, in the way that the early stories kind of didn't deal with it the way it's still dealt with now. Tom Baker, everyone bloody loves Tom Baker. Ark in Space is really good. Genesis of the Daleks is really good. Pyramids of Mars is really good. Robots of Death is really good. Image of the Fendal is excellent. And if you're a Douglas Adams fan, City of Death is really good as well, which was a script that Adams co-wrote with the producer because they were in a pinch and needed a script. So it's like, right, we'll just go and write. Well, then they spent a weekend writing it with the producer locked in a hotel room somewhere. So City of Death, really good. For the Fifth Doctor, Kinder's great but really weird. Earthshock is basically an action movie, but on a BBC budget. The Five Doctors was my favourite. It's the 20th anniversary special. It was my favourite story as I was growing up. And The Caves of Androzani is a very well-regarded Fifth Doctor story as well. For the Sixth Doctor, Vengeance on Varos. Vengeance on Varos is a really forward-looking Doctor Who story because it's about a world reality TV has kind of taken over and people don't watch fiction anymore. They just watch reality TV. And this was made in 1985. But the reality TV they're watching is like people getting tortured to death. And then it's like, vote now. Do we kill him or do we keep torturing him? Vote now.
Oh, so 2021 then?
Yeah, basically, yeah. So, and it's all done because it makes them a few quid. And every so often they have a general election. And in the general election, it's just, do enough people vote no against the current prime minister so he dies, because everyone who punches no zaps him a little bit harder with the death ray. And if enough people say yes, then he lives, and otherwise he dies, and they get a new leader, they get a new governor. So it's an oddly prescient story. Also features Sean Connery's son in his first TV role, Jason Connery, doing his first telly, which was for Vengeance on Varos. Revelation of the Daleks is also really good for the Colin Baker era, a bit dark. And finally, we've got Sylvester McCoy. Remembrance of the Daleks, excellent, was a real return to the form for the show after it had been a bit flabby for a little bit. Greatest Show in the Galaxy, it's fun, a bit odd, about a psychic circus. Ghostlight, excellent, really enjoy Ghostlight. No idea what the fuck is going on. I was at a Doctor Who convention in, it was about 1990, it might be in 89, where we had the writer of Ghost. I was just as an attendee, it wasn't one I organised, I was like 10 years old or something, but we had the writer of Ghostlight at this convention, and it was asked a question by the interviewer, which was, right, explain the plot of the story you wrote in 2 minutes, go. And the guy couldn't fucking do it because I've got no clue what's going on in Ghostlight. Curse of Fenric is excellent, vampire story, and the final episode is Survival, the very last episode of classic Doctor Who that they did. And I would recommend all of those. If that's a lot, and I appreciate that's a lot, if you want to drop any of them out, drop any of them out. They're all worth seeing, but they're not all essential. So, yeah, Doctor Who. I'll talk about Doctor Who till the cows come home.
Kelly also asked, how do you all deal with woo in the environmental movement? I constantly encounter woo and anti-GMO sentiments when looking for environmentally friendly products or companies. I don't want to support woo-filled companies, but I want to make environmentally friendly choices.
That's a tricky one. It reminds me of the Doctor Who story that I just talked about, the Green Death, where, oddly enough, all the environmentalists in that, they all live in a commune that's referred to as the Nut Hutch, and they're all hippies with long hair. And one of them's like a professor, but he's still a hippie with long hair who's worried about people leaving the door open and killing off his mushroom spores that he's devising in order to replace. And it's all very, the environmentalists are all portrayed as very kind of woo-friendly, hippie-ish sort of folks. And it's a problem that the environmental movement suffers from, is that they are linked with the pseudoscientific movement to such an extent. That's because there's a relationship there in kind of, back to earth, return to nature, that sort of stuff, gives a link between those two communities. But I think the environmental movement, suffers from the association that they have with pseudoscience. This is something my sister's very, very big environmentalist, has been for pretty much her whole life. And it's something she complains to me about routinely, is she will turn up at group meetings about this kind of stuff, and they'll sit down and say, right, we've got to do something about climate change. That's really important. We've got to do something about pollution, and we've got to do something about these damn 5G masts that they keep putting up everywhere, because they're going to ruin the world as well. And she's like, don't you realize that you undermine your own arguments when you talk about real legitimate issues like climate change and in the same breath say, oh yeah, and 5G as well? Because what you're doing is you're giving a motivation for people who are already motivated to dismiss the environmentalism thing to be able to dismiss the lot by just going, well, they're crackpots, aren't they? And that means they don't have to tackle with the uncomfortable thing, because you've tacked on something that's very readily, easily dismissible as a crackpot fringe view.
Yeah, it is incredibly difficult. I mean, I try and, as much as possible, be environmentally conscious in the stuff that I buy, the things that I do. But in doing that, you do come across, I see it with like organic type stuff. You see, you'll want to buy something that is more environmentally conscious, but it'll then say, and it's organically sourced or organically farmed. And it does make me sort of question in that case. I think the thing I try and do is weigh up which is the greater harm. And if there's a possibility of buying or doing something that ticks the environmental box without anything that has a woo supportive element to it, then I'll obviously do that. But where it's a case of environmentally friendly with a little bit of woo, or woo-free but environmentally shit, I'll go for the environmentally friendly, partly because that is the more important pressing issue right now is combating climate change and the awareness of, and trying to drive not just an awareness of that, but also an economic demand for that, to show that the demand is there, and therefore corporate interest will step in and start serving that demand further. And partly because I think the more we can do to encourage that generally, we can then carve open a space after that to be kind of anti-woo in that space. But I think that's the way we do it, rather than to have such a hard absolutist line that I won't touch anything that's got any traces of a pseudoscientific claim on it, even if it's for the greater good, as it were. Then I think we end up sort of in status quo. It's not something that comes up very often in the things that I do, but I think that's how I'd see it, really.
It's something that multiple of my partners have complained about as well, and it's something that Alice might be able to speak on with a little bit more authority. Is it's practically impossible to buy cosmetic products designed for women without it coming with some associated pseudoscientific claim of some stripe. Even if you wanted to be like, okay, I'm not going to buy cosmetics or cleansers or whatever that have got woo claims, you couldn't do it.
Yeah, they don't exist.
Because they just aren't there.
Mm.
Yeah, they really don't exist. I've actually just bought something exciting. I'm going to show you now. Hang on. Actually, I don't know whether they're making the claims on this or not. I bet they are somewhere. But I just bought this in the Black Friday sales, which is terrible, and you shouldn't buy things in Black Friday sales from big corporations, but still, I did it. This is an eye makeup palette, which is called Stoned Vibes. and the eyeshadows are infused with crystals.
Blimey.
Amazing.
Because crystals are so fashionable at the minute. I don't actually, because I try to not absorb myself in all the bollocks, I'm not actually sure whether they are marketing that as it's going to make you feel better because it's got crystals in it, or if they're just going for something that's fashionable and looks pretty and is a cool concept sort of thing. But yeah, it's everywhere that it is impossible to buy beauty products that don't have some woo claims. It's also impossible to buy the stuff that does have evidence behind it at a reasonable price, because they then bump the prices up for stuff that's got added active ingredients that they can make claims about.
Yeah, it's an actually works tax.
Well, the stuff that doesn't actually work also has the high price tag. But you have to like properly dig down if you want to understand skincare and the stuff that actually helps. The stuff I've talked about in the podcast before, obviously, like SPF genuinely does help if you want to prevent premature aging of your skin. But there are also a couple of active ingredients that they add to beauty products that do work, things like retinols that do have an actual effect. But you have to really dig down to see the difference between how, you know, they market retinols and the bollocks exactly the same way.
Yeah.
So you have to really dig to find it. And there are some great people who are doing like proper debunking beauty products. And there's some great Instagrammers and YouTubers and stuff that do it. But you really have to dig for it. It's really hard to find.
Mm. We have another couple of questions here from Emma, the best podcast guest, McClure. First, she asks, when is Mike going to write a placebo book?
So I've actually sat down and tried to write a placebo book. I've sat down, and what happens is I sit down and I load up my word processor and I stare at a blank page for an hour and a half and then go do something else. This is the problem that I'm faced with when trying to write a placebo book. I have actually written an introduction to the placebo book as well. I've written a preface. I've written a kind of, you know...
Don't you need to write a fuss before you preface?
Yes. But I don't know. I don't know whether that's something I'm going to do or not. It's something I'd like to do. It's something that's actually really difficult to do. It's something that we'll see if that happens. And of course, there's a big difference between writing it and somebody wanting to publish a fucker. There's a big gap there. Especially, hey, do you want this book about how all these medical people have got something wrong written by a web developer? Because that doesn't sound like a crackpot book at all. Yeah, don't know. We'll see.
Emma also asked, where is Be Reasonable? Is it harder to find people sufficiently outside of the mainstream these days? To be honest, I found Be Reasonable quite tricky once we got into the pandemic, really. So I recorded quite a few of them at the start of the year. All the ones that I put out this year, I recorded at the very start of the year. I think it's sort of like February and March kind of time. And once the pandemic really started to kick in, I think I found it quite difficult to find people who were interestingly outside of the mainstream in a way that wasn't so depressive to me that I could actually countenance having the conversation with everything that was kind of going on. And also, it was quite tricky to find things, or I was struggling to find things I'd not covered. And the last thing I kind of wanted was to have yet another conversation with a psychic saying the things that a psychic has said to me previously before. Mm. So I do want to carry Be Reasonable on, but I'm trying to figure out how best to do that in a way that doesn't become a massive mental burden for me. As I think it felt at times this year, the idea was sort of trying to get the ball moving on some Be Reasonable stuff felt quite a tricky thing to do. And also that I'm finding the right kind of claims and the right kind of topics to cover. When the show started, we had lots of things like people who believed that children had been beamed back from hybrid children who were hybridized with aliens have been beamed back in time to 15th century Somerset or something. And that felt sort of delightful, and having conversations with people like that and people who believe that pterosaurs are still flying around America right now felt quite charming, but unsustainably niche. And then as I start to move towards bigger claims that were much less charming and much more relevant, the emotional load of that gets much higher when you talk to white supremacists and people who believe that the Holocaust didn't happen and the Nazis were good guys. And so I'm just trying to find the right kind of balance. So I do want to bring the show, I do want to carry the show on, but I just want to figure out exactly how to do that in a way that doesn't become a massive toll on my emotional well-being. And Emma's final question that she'll be asking this episode, what does everyone think was the worst, most credulous thing you've seen in this dumpster fire of a year? Who wants to step in there?
Well, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because arguably, we already did this with the Skeptic Magazine Occam Awards.
Yeah, true.
Arguably, that's exactly the conversations that we all sat in with the other folks involved in Skeptic Magazine to talk about exactly this stuff, which is hydroxychloroquine. Specifically, obviously, we went with Didier Raoult on that, but that was because his research conferred a legitimacy upon those claims that then sent them off into orbit, which in a way that they might not have hit the mainstream in the way that they did without that mainstream support. But yeah, I think that has been one of the worst credulous things in this dumpster fire of a year, specifically with respect to the level of harm that it can do. Arguably, like the 5G stuff is more credulous, but I'm not convinced there's a lot of people dead because of 5G claims, whereas we can't say that about hydroxychloroquine.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly don't know. I don't know if there's that many people dead because of hydroxychloroquine either necessarily. I genuinely don't know, because I don't think it harmed people directly, but it was just selling a solution to something it couldn't do. Alice, you look like you're desperate to say something there.
Not desperate to say something. I was just saying it wasn't necessarily the hydroxychloroquine that was the harmful thing. It was the conferring legitimacy to something that was very bad science about something as important as COVID, and how that's played into lots of different narratives of what people believe about the pandemic and how those beliefs have changed over the course of the last few months, and how we've got to a position where people don't, people in America might trust their Donald Trump, but not trust their experts because of the way that the hydroxychloroquine stuff has been communicated there, and people in other parts of the world will have different beliefs based on different messaging around those things. And it's a symptom of a wider issue rather than specifically harmful in and of itself, although it is still, it has killed people.
I was going to argue there, actually, that I think there will be a non-zero number of people are dead because they have believed the hydroxychloroquine claim.
Yeah, for sure.
Either because it means they haven't taken the relevant precautions that they think, because, I'll just take some or I have taken some hydroxychloroquine, which means I'm fine, I'm immune, it's not going to be a problem.
And also, I mean, there was a couple in America who died from taking what they thought was hydroxychloroquine because they took the pond cleaner.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Which is a source of hydroxychloroquine and also poisonous and dangerous and damaging and harmful.
But actually, to walk back what I said earlier with respect to 5G causes COVID claims, there's probably a non-zero number of people who've died because of that as well, for the same reasons that they think, well, it's caused by 5G, isn't it? So I don't need to take these precautions and these, I don't need to wear a mask. I don't need to social distance because it's caused by 5G. It's not actually, there's not a virus. So maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe I'll walk those claims back.
Yeah, I think to me the most credulous thing has been the people who've held the belief that this whole thing is a big scam. The people who followed the pandemic claims, who believe this was manufactured and not as deadly as you think. And we're seeing it even now. Right now, there's still people saying, well, there's 130 people for every 100,000 are getting it in Liverpool, or 1,300 people for every 100,000 getting in Liverpool. That's not that bad. It's absolutely fine. This is all a massive overreaction. Businesses should carry on as they were. People should go about their lives as they were. This is all just part of a great conspiracy to control you and to shut you down your movement and infringe your liberties, right down to fucking Peter Hitchens banging on constantly on Twitter and in various other places about how we shouldn't be taking any of the measures that we're taking. And from Peter Hitchens' own deep academic credentials and scientific expertise, he believes he understands better than 99% of epidemiologists internationally. I think those are the claims I've seen kind of most credulous, really, the ones who don't think this is even real and think the entire planet has basically been on part-time contract for the last 10 months over something that doesn't exist. That's the stuff that I think boggles my mind the most.
So moving on, Alfred has asked us about our best and worst of 2020. I think we've tackled the worst quite comprehensively so far.
I mean, it's the coronavirus, personally. I'd say that's
probably the worst thing.
That's been the worst.
Probably the worst thing of 2020.
100%.
The destruction of democracy in the United States is also pretty bad, as is the exiting of the European Union. But on balance, I think probably the millions of dead people is probably the thing I think is the worst thing of 2020. The best, however, from my perspective, I don't know how you guys feel about it, is seeing the way that people have come together as a result of the pandemic. Notably, I think Skeptics of the Pub Online has done really well in that regard in terms of, okay, this is a shitty situation. What can we do to be supportive and to help people continue to have a social outlet, and doing that within the framework of the pandemic? I think that was a really excellent thing. On a sillier note, Doctor Who fandom's done really well on that as well, with the watch parties that they've been doing, which they've recently resumed since the second. They'd stopped them in kind of like June, July-ish, and they've resumed them with the second lockdown, where you've got actors and writers turning up and joining Twitter just to take part in the watch parties, and they're all very informal. They're mostly organised by Emily Cook, and it's all okay. It's 7:00 on this day. We're all going to press play on this episode and then just tweet about it together. And it's been really nice to see. It's been really nice to watch people joining in and socializing and coming together when times are tough, when times are hard like that. I think that's been really nice.
I think best for me, I think, Skeptics of the Pub Online and how that's kind of come together has been up there. Taking over the Skeptic Mag and how that's been received with the way that we're trying to do things, and seeing people who are excited to write for us, people who are excited to read the stuff that we're putting out, showing that you can do skepticism without being that kind of judgmental arsehole, without being that sense of superiority, inherent superiority, with that kind of compassion for understanding that the people we disagree with aren't monsters because we disagree with them. I think that's been quite exciting. And the worst, it's very hard to pick out a worst because of how bad everything's been. But one thing that I've found really difficult is not traveling to give talks, not seeing people, not being on stage and talking and telling stories, and being able to go around the many skeptics in the pub groups in the country. And even I had plans to be going to various parts of the world. I mean, we all had plans to be going to Australia and New Zealand, and we had to cancel those. It's been really hard not being able to see this community that we have in person, and the community that we know we have, which is the skeptics in the pub groups, the people who are actually doing skepticism and bringing people together in that kind of way. It's been really tough not getting out to see those in person. That's been, in a shit year, that's been one of the things that's been pretty dire.
So for me, one of the best things I'm now rudely reminded about is it's been really nice to spend lots of time at home with my dogs. As Lupin's clambering all over me, trying to climb up the bookcase to get at the advent calendars. No, stop it. Oi!
And this was your best and not your worst.
Best and worst. Genuinely, he's realised, like, the advent calendars are out of his reach. Obviously, chocolate not permissible for dogs, but he knows that they are there, and he is doing his damnedest to get at them. So that's a nice thing. Having two dogs to help me through lots of lockdowns and lots of working from home and lots of isolation. And yeah, I think you're right, both of you, that Skeptics in the Pub Online is fantastic. I'm so glad to be part of it, that we've managed to pull that off, because it's such a great thing. And I'm so happy to see that community grow and to bring skeptics in the pub groups from around the country actually together. You and I, Marsh, are very lucky that we get to meet a lot of the skeptics in the pub groups by going and giving talks and things. And they're all really, really great, but they don't always have the opportunity to interact with each other apart from at QED. Mm-hmm. So it's a nice way to actually get more of the community actively talking to each other and actively being involved in things. And it's, yeah, I think that's brilliant that exists and that we've managed to do that. The worst. Personally, yeah, I'm probably with you, Marsh. I miss travelling to meet other skeptics in the pub groups. That was a nice thing to do. I miss spending time with my friends. Like, shitty that we can't actually do that. I don't think I've seen you since March, Mike.
No.
You haven't seen him since he gave you COVID, or since you gave him COVID? Or since I gave you both COVID?
Since we exchanged COVIDs.
Yeah.
At least, like, Marsh lives around the corner, so we can go for socially distanced walks occasionally. But Mike, I haven't seen you face to face since fucking March. It's horrible.
No. Be thankful for small mercies.
But yeah, they're small things compared to actually the situation on the whole. And, you know, I think broadly the three of us are probably reasonably lucky compared to a lot of other people who are going through the same sort of situation. So,
and Alfred finishes off with what I hope is going to be a brighter note to end on. What are our hopes and fears for 2021? Now, before we recorded when we were just going through these questions of, which we're going to have time to talk about and which we're not, I'd said that my hopes and fears for 2021 is that I hope it gets better and I fear it won't. But have you guys got anything more specific to say than that?
I mean, the only thing keeping me going and keeping me positive is there's a vaccine. There are vaccines out. There are people being vaccinated. There are people we know who've been vaccinated, or at least you know, Mike, who've been vaccinated.
Yeah, my dad's been vaccinated, yeah.
So the idea that will come, maybe it'll be by Easter, is what Boris is now saying. Not Christmas as he originally promised, but we'll be back to normal by Easter is what he's now hinting towards. That, I think, is something that's keeping me kind of going. And also, hopefully, once we're actually are able to be vaccinated and can return to some semblance of normal life, people will kind of actually remember what this now is like and how rubbish it is. And hopefully then when they're back in the real world, appreciate that a little bit. That's the thing. I can't wait until the first Skeptics in the Pub meeting we can have, where we can all be in the same room and have a drink and go to Dr. Duncan's pub and go to the Casa Bar that we do our events in.
It feels like a lifetime ago. It feels like that's an actual other world.
It does. It really does. So I'm hoping and I'm excited about a time where we can get back to that.
In fairness, they have always said it will be over by Easter. Now, they did mean last Easter, not next Easter, but that has been the message since day one.
Yeah.
The vaccine thing feeds into the best of 2020 as well. Like, the scientific progress we've made throughout COVID is phenomenal. Like, that we have vaccines that have been approved for use in humans in less than a year since people started working on it is incredible, utterly incredible.
And shows what the scientific enterprise can do with the goodwill and the funding. You know, we mentioned this very briefly on one of the earlier shows, that it's not necessarily that the vaccine is being rushed through or that anything's been skipped or corners cut. It's that when you're normally going through human trials or something, it's 9 months waiting for your grant application to be declined before you put the next one in, you know, and that's where an awful lot of the time is spent. You have anything else on that?
I mean, do you want to offer any hopes there, Mike?
No.
No hopes.
There is no hope. Abandon all hope, ye who enter 2021.
I think I tend to be quite pragmatic about things in a slightly odd way. And maybe, Mike, you're similar, because we're similar in some ways, that I don't like to hope for things, because hoping for things means that you're extra sad when they don't happen. So, for example, like, I've had to cancel a lot of things this year. A lot of things. But for each of them, like, basically from March, I've been anticipating cancelling all of them, and I've been quite trying to not get my hopes up that, oh, well, maybe we can have this. The exception being Christmas, which is why Christmas is extra frustrating. But, like, in some ways, I think it can be quite positive to be a little bit more pragmatic and say, you know, we can hope things are better. We can hope that we continue to make progress. We can hope that things get easier and that we start to get some semblance of normality back. But specifically what that looks like, I don't want to put all my hopes into, I want to be back in Skeptics in the Pub by March, because then I'll just be disappointed when it ends up being September by the time we get everybody vaccinated, or, you know, things like that.
But with my corporate hat on, but also meaning this in a very genuine way as well, what I really hope is to see a terrific number of our listeners at QED next year. I really hope that QED can happen.
Yeah.
I hope that we can pull it off. I hope that it's going to be an excellent time. I hope people listening to this are going to be there. And I hope people are going to come up to me and say, you said you hoped that this would happen, and here it is, it's happening. Fingers crossed that's going to happen. Touch wood. All that other shit we don't believe in. You know, I really hope that that's going to happen, and we're going to get to see some people again. So with all that said, I think that is all we have time for.
I think so.
All that remains is for me to thank Marsh for coming along today.
Thank you very much, and Merry Christmas.
And thank you to Alice.
Thank you.
We've been Skeptics with a K. We hope you've enjoyed our meandering rambles this episode. I hope you have a fantastic Christmas and a happy new year. And we will see you all next year.
See you in 2021.
Bye now. Merry Christmas.
Skeptics with a K is a production of the Merseyside Skeptics Society. For more information, visit our website www.merseysideskeptics.org.uk or email podcast@merseysideskeptics.org.uk.
I left Lupin in the living room hoping he would behave for the whole recording, but I've just heard something clatter.
All right, you go and find out what it was. Do that. We'll figure out the next couple questions. So I can ask these ones from Kelly.
Mm-hmm.
Alice can do those from Emma.
What are you doing?
And then we'll do these last
have you done questions from Emma?
No, I've not, but I've just realised the next question from Emma includes where is be reasonable. It's weird for me to ask else that. Actually, what if Alice does this Kelly one?
Hang on.
Good boy.
Fucking not. That's it. Good boy. Sit down. Good boy. One sec. Yeah.
Just Alice delivering 50% of her conversation at the wall as she tries to stop Lupin eating something that will probably kill him.